All right, so I'm glad to see everybody here. I don't wish to disappoint, but I cannot tell you who's going to win the Democratic nomination or who will be our next president. But I do want to talk a little bit both about the candidates and some of the significant dimensions, it seems to me, that are important in considering the electorate, as it were, and the issues that I think make some difference from my perspective. And it's just a perspective, obviously. The only people I take more seriously are the people who predicted that Trump would win in 2016. I was not one of them, obviously. In fact, I think I spoke here the week before the election, commenting on the polls at that time. So I'm not coming here to speak ex cathedra on matters of the electorate. But before I go into some detail, what I would like to get a sense of from everybody here, because I think this is part of the challenge, as it were, of understanding the current political reality. So what I think is that part of the problem to understand where we are and where we're likely to go is to get a real sense of how people experience this election, how they experience the candidates, how they experience the political reality with which we are confronted. Right. And I would find it fascinating and helpful, and if I could get some sense from people here, just to get some feeling about your sense of candidates, who you respond to in a positive or negative way, and for what reason. Relatively briefly, but if anyone here who would like to share their thoughts, I would love to hear that, because that's part, I think, of trying to understand where we are politically, what candidates are most likely to emerge and likely to be more or less successful. Now, we are, of course, a selective audience, so it's not a random selection. The electorate by any stretch of the imagination. But it would be interesting to get some sense of where everybody is at. So, anyone, I would like to hear from you, if you could share with us, just for a minute, not more perhaps, to let me hear your thoughts.
Well, first I just want to say that my head is spinning. I can't figure out anything. Everybody that I initially liked has kind of gotten less in my, gone down in my feelings for, my expectations, my hopes, my dreams, anything. I just really...
Why is that, though? That's what I want to know.
Because nobody seems to be doing it. Nobody seems to be... Other people like somebody that I don't like very much at all anymore, and I thought initially, like 2 years ago, she would have been a great candidate, but now I'm not thrilled with her. And other people...
Who's the her?
I'd rather not say.
Oh, fine, okay.
I get it.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. That's fine, just wanted impressions.
I think the most important thing to do is to beat Trump. And I think the only candidate that can do it is Joe Biden.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Yes. Without sounding like an ageist, I could not vote for Biden and I could not vote for Sanders because they will be well into their 80s by the time the election is well underway.
Okay.
And that concerns me.
All right. Sure.
I heard someone speaking once about how great it is for your career to run for president. Right. So without really any expectation of succeeding at it, it's putting yourself out and getting your name known. So one thing that's really a problem is how the field is just cluttered by people who are advancing their own careers and really have no chance, realistically, of getting there.
Right. Okay. Any other? Yes. Oh.
I just wanted to say that I am actually very pleased with all the candidates. I understand there's a plus and minus and maybe too much clutter, but each of them seems to be putting good ideas on the table. And yes, they make mistakes. And yes, they go down in the polls because of those mistakes. But the good ideas, the range of good ideas, I think is impressive.
Okay. And yes.
Is it possible, just hearing, I'm very impressed with that, is there a way that we can have the good ideas organized under the cluster of so many candidates? That is there, we can find a good organizer of good ideas amongst them. And that would be helpful in our challenges as we go forward.
Any other comment? Yes.
Well, I think Sanders is really important. I don't think he'll win the nomination.
Speak up a little bit, Joe.
I think Sanders is really important. I don't think he'll win the nomination, but I think he's pushing the party. And he keeps it going. He's brought up so many important things, and he's brought out some important people, and I like Elizabeth Warren. Yes.
Okay, let's.
I'm going to say something probably a little controversial.
Okay.
And that is, I've watched from afar, right, whenever I read and see a digest, that there's a party that knows how to move people, because most people are motivated more by fear than by desire, okay? And the Democrats haven't a clue about that, right? And they don't know how to leverage, in a good way, people's fear, so they can say, oh my God, I don't want that, so I want this. They have no idea. The other side, if you will, knows how to do it, knows how to move people viscerally, and I don't think any of the Democrats know how to do it, except I like Stacey Abrams, who's a whole other thing.
Okay. Yes.
Stacey Abrams, she's not right.
Yeah.
I know, I said she only person.
George.
The guy I like,
Let's
Pete Buttigieg.
yeah.
Yes.
He's
What is it you like about him?
He's a Rhodes Scholar. He's brilliant, and he went to the Iraq War. He volunteered to the Iraq War, and everything. He's everything that Trump is not. The one who does have a problem. He's married to a guy, so that takes care of that.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Too young.
Okay. Yes.
I'm not sure if this other person, Keto, tall.
Beto overall?
Beto, yes. He impresses me. And I think along with
Why is that?
what he says makes sense, and he doesn't go wild with emotion, but he presents a lot of good ideas. And Elizabeth Warren and he, I think, would make a very good.
Okay, I just wanted to get just a thought, and this is, get the variation here is already representative, I think, in a small way, of the strange, complicated variation in the current field, as it were. Now, a few obvious things, which everybody knows, but I guess it's not bad to repeat the obvious, that the way the candidates have so far lined up in terms of the polling, right, is basically, you might say that there have been three bunches. The small people at the top, some people really just that are sort of in the middle, you might say, and a large number of people that are really at the bottom. Right? At the top, in almost all the polls, clearly, have been Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, right, and Bernie Sanders, historically. Right? And that's remained fairly constant, but there has been a slow change. I mean, slow diminution of Biden's support, a slow diminution of Sanders' support, right? And a significant increase in Warren's support. In fact, I was watching last evening this program on MSNBC. It's a weekend program with Danny Deutsch, which I really have never watched before, discussing it. It began talking about the surge in support for Elizabeth Warren, right? Where in some recent polls, she's now ahead of all of them in Iowa and in New Hampshire. I don't know exactly which polls he was referring to. That was a main theme of his discussion. And then they were talking about how people respond to her. Right? So those three have been really in the top, more or less systematically. Secondarily, the second tier, as it were, hanging in there. I mean, I say numbers. I mean, Biden has been in the 20s by and large. The upper 20s, mid-20s, coming down a little bit. Sanders was up, but was sort of around 20s, talking about nationally by and large. It's different state by state. We'll come back to that in a moment. Right? And he has slipped down now, I'd say clearly to third position, somewhere around the mid-teens. And Warren was in the sort of the mid-teens. She's come up now to around, more or less around 20, sort of passing Sanders in the numbers. And then the second tier really is Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg. They've more or less been sticking around. Now, she's come down a little. First debate, she zoomed up with her challenge to Biden, and then she's fallen back. And she and he have been about between 7 and 9%, more or less, in the polls. Really not getting into double digits, except perhaps in California, where she's from. Right? So she's been staying in there, and and their fundraising is more or less comparable. It's not quite the same. Buttigieg has done much better in fundraising, probably because of tremendous support from the gay community, one can assume. Sanders has a really dedicated following, right? Small donors, and we can talk about the significance of that. So they're I think, I noticed, for example, that the Democratic Socialists of America at their recent national convention voted, number one, to support Sanders, endorse him, and to say they wouldn't support anybody else. I think that kind of concern among the more, what you want to call it here, the far left of the mainstream spectrum. I don't get off to the far left, like the Green Party and others. But within the electoral spectrum, that could be a real problem. We can come back to that in terms of the long-term significance. It's important to realize that something like 12% of Sanders' supporters in 2016 voted for Donald Trump. If you want to try to process that and what that might mean, okay. So sort of an anti-establishment convention, which may be less progressive than it seems, but more anti-establishment and protesting. And that could be a real problem if that's the way it follows out, the way in which, for example, the recent vote at the National Convention of the Democratic Socialists of America suggested that it might. That could be highly problematic. And then there's the lower tier. Cory Booker has been struggling to get some kind of recognition and hasn't really gotten much before 2 or 3% of the vote. All right. For example, use him as an example. Who else? I think that's really beyond that. Amy and you can start going down the list. You might find an uptick in Tom Steyer because he has lots of money. He's just entered into the race, but he has enough money to buy him access to the debates. In some sense, he's gone out with a campaign saying, using a lot of money to spend to get people to contribute $1. So he can get the 135,000 individual contributions, which is one of the two qualifying characteristics. And the other is getting 2% in at least, I think, 4 different national polls. So it seems to me quite likely that he will be able to accomplish both of those, given the money he has. Whatever the long-term projections of that significance is, I don't know. And the rest of them are really a struggle to get any kind of traction of any significance. Different places, some people have resonated. Andrew Yang has these fascinating ideas about dealing with the automation economy. In terms of what Ralph was saying, I think there are a lot of interesting ideas, and he has a lot of interesting ideas. I don't think no one thinks that he's a serious candidate in terms of possible selection, nor particularly problematic in the way in which the Sanders followers might be in terms of who they will support down the road. And, our local senator Kirsten Gillibrand has not been able to get more than 1% any place. And there are a whole bunch of others. We could talk about each one of these people, and I'm glad to do it, not that I consider myself an expert on the policies of each one. But so far the race has, in general, been focusing really on from 5 to 7 people. I see there are 9 people now that are scheduled to be in the next debate. I suspect there will be some more. And the 9 are the ones we've just mentioned, plus Julio Castro from, and Beto O'Rourke, who have also, they've been hovering a little bit under Buttigieg and Kamala Harris, maybe a little above that bottom. So that gives you basically the 9. Andrew Yang, by the way, has made the next debate, right? Because he has a very significant support among the digital community, you might say. All right, it's a tremendous support and significant amount of money that he's made in that process. And I think you'll find a few others. I would expect Tom Steyer to be among that for reasons I just mentioned. So we'll see how that and the general assumption, of course, is that if you can't maintain and meet these criteria, and they'll get stricter for December, then you're probably out of the running, as the case may be. Again, I don't want to prejudge any of that. So I suspect you'll end up with 11 or 12, maybe still in September. We'll see. But we need to understand that in America, obviously, we don't vote at a national level. I mean, everybody knows that in one level. We should have to process that. We vote state by state. So it is a series of really distinct elections that take place. And the constituencies in each of these states are significantly different. Right? For example, there is a lot of attention paid to what happens in South Carolina, a state which is very unlikely to go Democratic under any conditions within the foreseeable future, right? But which the large majority of Democratic voters in South Carolina are black. And so the black vote will number one determine almost certainly who wins the South Carolina primary, and secondly, who wins that primary would suggest, in a very important way, who has the major support among the black community. And in that primary, so far, the most popular person by far is Joe Biden. Right? Now, that's an interesting question. We can reflect on why it is that Joe Biden seems to have his greatest support among the black community. Right? But he is in the South Carolina polling so far, he suggests like he's 2-1 ahead of anybody. Right? And if we remember back in 2016, Bernie Sanders got wiped out by Hillary Clinton in South Carolina, and has generally been considered to have significant problems with the black community, as, for example, Pete Buttigieg seems to have for different reasons, having to do with the way he's dealt with the police in South Bend since he's become mayor. We could get into that also. So we have to understand that the primaries take place state by state, as of course does the general election. Right? We know that. In fact, there have been many significant analyses of the coming election, particularly people like Nate Silver, for example, who suggested it's entirely possible that the Democratic candidate, whoever it is, could win the national vote with a greater plurality by far than Hillary Clinton did, which was close to 3 million votes, could win with over 5 or 6 million votes, and still lose the general election. Right? Because of the way in which this country has increasingly reorganized itself, right, through people's movements, for example. People tend to move to areas they feel more comfortable with. That's a whole other discussion. So we've had an increasing development in America in which states and in which congressional districts have tended to become more clearly one-party states or one-party districts. Right? And then one focuses in on the relatively small number, generally speaking, of congressional districts which are, quote, in play, that are not clearly red or clearly white, but blue, and which clearly, ones in which one candidate wins by significantly more than 10% of the vote. And the same thing has happened to some extent in a lot of states. Now, there are interesting polls at present which suggest that there are some significant changes at the state level in these areas. For example, polls which have a Democratic candidate at present ahead in Arizona, a place which is fairly Republican, or in Texas, actually, by 1 percentage point in some polls. Right? And so I'm not going to prejudge. It's really, the polls are, and the contemporary attention span at the moment is really quite unreliable for several different reasons, not the least of which is most people don't pay that much attention to elections until about Labor Day before the election, which puts us more than a year away. Right? And so the political activity is really led to a large extent by the most ideologically involved and most active people in each constituency. And that tends to push discussions in more left-wing directions in the Democratic Party and more right-wing directions within the Republican Party. But we're not really going to talk about the Republican Party here, because we're really focusing at this point on reflecting upon the Democratic candidates and how their campaigns are evolving. And so what is it that we need to look at as we try to evaluate the race? There are several issues that are important ideologically and several issues that are important, you might say, demographically or in terms of the electorate. Ideologically, right, there is more or less a divide at three levels, you might say, between the more articulate, I don't know what you want to call it, left-wing candidates, the ones who are trying to charge out, to articulate I would call it a sort of left-of-center strategy, and the ones who seek to present themselves as more moderate. And I think it's important to say, though, and this is a testament to the work of Bernie Sanders over the last several years, that the entire party has moved to the left in ways that is really quite obvious. Now, how that relates with the electorate is another question, right? But it's clear on issues. I mean, just take gun control, which, by the way, is not something that Sanders has led on at all. In fact, it's something he's been sort of dragged along on. His history on gun control is more questionable. But it is certainly Sanders who has sort of led in raising issues, certainly about questions of health care and universal health care and Medicare for all. I mean, but on a whole range of other issues having to do with college tuition, free college tuition, and we could go into a whole series of issues that have pushed the political spectrum it made it legitimate to consider more progressive positions. And they have more or less come to move the Democratic Party as a framework somewhat to the left. So that even the, call it more moderate candidates, are significantly to the left of where they would have been 8 years ago. Significantly to the left of where Barack Obama ever was. Right? I mean, there's a kind of halo around Barack Obama now because he's being compared to the present occupant. Right? But you have to remember that, and so it's a very complicated issue for how progressive candidates deal with his legacy. Some have been criticized for criticizing his legacy, and understandably. At the same time, it was Barack Obama who came into power and bought the Paulson-Bush plan to bail out, right, the banks under Ronald Reagan during the savings and loan crisis back in the mid-'80s. Over 100 bankers went to jail under Ronald Reagan. Not one under Barack Obama. Right? I mean, you cannot understand the rising of the Tea Party and the unbelievably effective success of the Republican Party in 2010, which gave them the power, right, to control state legislatures and to totally redistrict them in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan and North Carolina. You cannot understand that except as a success of the Tea Party as a partial legitimate response to the sellout to the business community of Barack Obama. I mean, it's just clear and obvious. Right? And then you compare the politics. You may remember the grand bargain that Barack Obama tried to work with John Boehner in 2012 around Social Security and Medicare. Right? I don't know if you remember that or you don't remember it. Right? Right? But it basically was to sell out Social Security. Right? And the only thing that stopped that grand bargain, which was motivated in part by the commission that Obama appointed to look into Social Security, in which he appointed 2 far-right Republican, Simpson from Wyoming, and a right-wing Democrat from Tennessee, I believe it was. All right? All right? I mean, the only thing that saved us from the sellout on Social Security was the Tea Party, because they wouldn't go along with anything Obama wanted to do. Right? I just used that to get a sense. Now, so, you know, the part of the success of Joe Biden is the identification with Obama, and part of the identification with Obama is, well, he was obviously black, and that's not irrelevant in a condition in which racism is essentially one of the 2 prongs of the right-wing strategy, well, one of 3 prongs of the right-wing strategy of Trump. One is racism, one is anti-immigration, and one is destruction of anything which impedes the unlimited activity of the corporate world. All right? Whether it's the destruction of regulations or the promotion of unbelievable tax benefits. All right? All right. So that's the prongs of the Trump movement. All right? And we'll come back to that in a moment. But to understand that presents the ambiguity of Democratic politics, because the party has moved significantly to the left of Barack Obama and clearly Joe Biden, who has always been a non-leftist, to put it at least. I mean, we can go back to his dealing with Anita Hill. We can go back to his relation. We can go on and on. Right? Obama and Biden is talking as if, right? We can go back to the good old days if he gets elected. The good old days were the days of the systematic all-out war against the Democratic Party, which was began under the age of Bill Clinton and has carried on under Mitch McConnell throughout the whole of the Obama administration. Seeking to, you know, the evidence has shown that, for example, recent report that Obama actually exported more immigrants than Trump has been able to do. And he did that. Why did he do it? Well, he was trying to appease so he could come to some mutual understanding with the Republican Party, who obviously had absolutely no interest in coming to an understanding with him. And I don't know if he ever learned that message. So it seemed that, to me, in the last years of his administration, he began to seem to realize that this was like fighting a war with one hand tied behind your back. So there is a problem when you look at the politics of the Democratic Party. It has really significantly moved to the left, and the public debate has in some sense moved to the left at that point. Right? While at the same time, from the Republican Party and those who supported them, it's moved farther to the right. So the polarization is much deeper. And you're left to the question, all right, now let's look at the constituencies. Right? What are the relevant constituencies which are, quote unquote, in play? You know, what would make the difference? It's not the electorate at large. The Democrats will win in California by millions of votes. That's not going to solve the problem in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina. Right? You look back, you look at 2018, and you say, well, what is it that led to the significance of the Democratic victory in 2018? A victory, by the way, which is underappreciated, not overappreciated. Because people talk about how the Democrats gained some 40-some-odd seats. Right? And that was an unusual amount. But people don't talk about the fact that they did that by beating the Republicans by over 9%. That has never happened in an off-year election. Right? And the only reason why it was only 40-some-odd seats and not the 60 that the Republicans gained in 2010 is because of the gerrymandering. The extensive gerrymandering. Not speak of the money question, which is also relevant to Citizens United. Right? Right? So actually the success of the Democrats in 2018 was even far greater. But it's not a success that one can take for granted. Because those districts are still the gerrymandered districts. The same as, by the way, in New York State, if we talk about the Democratic control of the state Senate, which was an astounding victory in 2018. The first time in all of our lifetimes the Democrats have really had control of the state Senate in New York State. The first time. Right? And they went from being down 32-31 in New York State to being up 39 to 32 2, I guess it is, right? I mean, and including on Long Island, which used to be the bastion of the Republican Party of the state of New York, with what they called the Long Island Nine, all Republicans in the state Senate, not one Democrat in the state Senate, right? Until Kaminsky in 2014, and that's because Dean Skelos went to jail. And then we got John Brooks in the South Shore, and that's only because he was running against our ex-supervisor's son, Venditto, who was under indictment, and ultimately has been convicted. And so, because Venditto's son was the candidate, I mean, he was probably appropriately he tends to be, by the way, a neighbor of the Pfeiffers. He lives next door to them, basically. Well, he got tagged with the sins of his father. I think justifiably, but anyway. So we got John Brooks as a senator. Right? But this year we took 4 more. Democrats did, right, in the state senate. I won't go into details on it, but those are still Republican gerrymandered districts. So one should not assume that because the success in 2018 is easily replicated unless one addresses the issues which led to that success. All right, so what is it? What can we draw from that success? Well, one thing to think about is, where did the Democrats have their success in 2018? Right? And we've heard a lot, and I think rightfully so, about the remarkable accomplishments of people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right, in defeating Joe Crowley in Queens and the Bronx, or Ayanna Pressley up in Boston, beating Michael Capuano, right? And of course, Ilhan Omar and Rashid Tlaib, the so-called squad, right? That's absolutely crucial, obviously, for Trump's campaign, right, to run against them. That's what we'll come back to that in a moment. Right? And those were successes in terms of promoting a progressive agenda. Those were successes in terms of, as it were, increasing the diversity of the Democratic representation. And the Democratic representation of the House of Representatives is remarkable compared with the Republican representation, which is almost all white males in suits. Right? But each one of those successes, and practically all of the left-wing successes, came against more conservative Democrats. The people who were able to replace Republicans and made the significant switch in the electoral process were not Democrats in the mold of AOC or Presley or Tlaib or Ilhan Omar. Whatever one thinks of them. I actually like them. Right? I even wrote a little blog in which I reproduced Ilhan Omar's letter to the New York Times, because I think she's gotten a real bad rap. But that's another story. The point is that the success of the Democrats in 2018 in flipping this U.S. Congress was done by Democrats in essentially Republican-leaning districts or mainstream districts around the country, to a large extent in suburban metropolitan areas, almost entirely. Right? Suburban metropolitan areas. And primarily motivated, most analysis suggest, by being able to switch white middle-class women's votes in suburbia. That was probably the most significant thing that accounted for the success, and I'm again oversimplifying, that accounted for the success of this switch, right? And I think that it's important to think that the keys to a success of the Democrats in 2020 is really linked to a couple of conflicting tensions. One is being able to maintain and expand, number one, the actual votes of suburban white primarily women, but not exclusively, suburban white women. Number two, also very important, is maintaining the motivation and enthusiasm, and some extent anti-Trump enthusiasm, of black and Hispanic communities and of the youth. You have to maintain and engender that enthusiasm and organize and mobilize them to be actively involved in the campaign and to actually go out and vote in significant numbers. But that is to some extent in tension with the need not to scare off, not to frighten, right, the suburban white women who played such a significant role and are so turned off, for example, by what is happening at the border with families being separated, the children. Okay? And the third unreported, unappreciated dimension of the 2018 vote is what is the impact on the high school educated white working class. Right? And that includes in suburban and rural areas where there was a significant movement of them away from their almost reflexive identification with the Republican Party. I mean, I'm going to give you numbers here. All right? The difference was not fantastic, and often not significant enough for the Democrats to take those seats, especially given gerrymandering. And if you're down, if you lose a seat, if you had lost a seat by 65-35, and you gained 10 percentage points, and you lost 55-45, you still lost. But if you do that in Michigan, and in Wisconsin, and in Pennsylvania and Ohio, you win the state if you can cut down that vote. Right? So we're talking about constituencies without getting into a complicated numbers. And by the way, I would suggest, if you're interested, there are a couple of fascinating analyses of the voting patterns. Thomas Edsall tends to write in the New York Times. Usually I think it's on Wednesdays. And he's had a few different, I actually copied a few things, but fortunately I'm going to keep away from them here. But you can go, check up Edsall's arguments in the New York Times. And I refer to two particular ones. What he basically does is he follows voting patterns. He's done it for 50 years. And he communicates with key analysts of voting statistics and voting pattern behavior. And he incorporates that in his reports. Right? And he had two of them. One is the Democratic Party is actually three parties, and that was in, I don't have the date here. Okay. And another one was, do I have it here? There are really two distinct white working classes. Right? So I bring those to your attention. You can look them up, and they're worth reading to really appreciate the electorate, which often gets lost if you are ensconced in a specific community and only hear the echo chamber which the community gives you. That is a problem I must say that I encounter regularly among the Progressive Coalition and the Citizen Action and a lot of the groups that I am involved with, who act as if Ocasio-Cortez is the second revelation. And it's just a matter of time before they take over the country. I might say a consummation devoutly to be wished, but not on the contemporary horizon. So it's important to look at that kind of stuff. And if you want to follow the polls, I would recommend the website Real Clear Politics. They do that kind of regularly. The thing I would say there is they take the polls and they always average them. I think that is quite misleading at the present time because of the volatility, the lack of attention the vast number of people have. And I think it's really more important just to see the trends that are out there. And if you average it over a few polls over 3 months, you don't get the appreciation of the significant differences that might have happened from, June to July to August. And you wouldn't get, for example, I think that the significant movement that I've mentioned about Sanders and Warren and others. So I want to come back to, and I will wrap this up so that we're on time here, to come back to distinguishing then between the ideological differences among the candidates and the constituencies to which one is appealing and what one needs to appeal to. Right? And there is a dynamic that's out there in terms of the contemporary democratic process in which you need to have large numbers of individual donors. You need to mobilize them in some way, and that requires you to be more dramatic, and given the constituency which is more involved, it requires you to be more progressive, more radically so perhaps. And for example, one example is the calling to abolish ICE. Or as Castro has done, the effort to say we want to get rid of the law which treats it as a crime to illegally enter the country. Right? That's an example of, number one, appealing to one's heart and one's base and cutting yourself off at the feet. Because there's anything that the vast majority of the people in this country will not support. Right? Is making it perfectly okay to illegally enter the country. Why give the right that option when it's even the arguments that Castro, and by the way Elizabeth Warren used, are self-defeating. They say, well, they got to get rid of it because Trump has been using that argument. Yeah, well, the aim is to replace Trump. You don't have to use the argument. It's been on the books for years and it doesn't have to get used. So the argument is circular. Right? But the point is, you take something which is clearly in your favor, namely the attitude and the outrage that people have to the way in which Trump has addressed the problem of immigration, and you undercut it with a position which is hardly at all popular. Certainly not popular among the white high school educated working class. They hate it. The numbers are clear. 75 to 15%. They're opposed to it. Why do you have to do that? Well, I think the arguments are somewhat similar on questions having to do with the insistence that Bernie Sanders has had made, and this is obviously a debatable issue, right? In the abolition of private health insurance, and in saying that and he makes a very impressive, rational case about how much better single-payer Medicare would be to private insurance, right? But there are 160, 170 million people who have private insurance, whatever they think. And I get from my left-wing people, yeah, but if you do the polls, you'll find they don't like their insurance carrier. If you can tell them that they will still have their own doctor, the polls change. Well, that is probably true in some sense, but that's not politically, I think, realistic in the electoral process, right? And it's not necessary. And you want to get yourself elected, then you can fight for universal health care. Right? But to take on a position which is relatively undercuts, I mean, you could talk about what did the Democrats win in 2018? They talked about being sure that your pre-existing condition will not be an impediment. Well, you can run on that issue. You can talk about a public option. Those are all very popular. But if you insist ideologically on saying, all right, and we're going to take away your health care because we're going to give you something better, and you think the American people are going to believe that or trust that, there's no evidence for that. And you can find some polls, if you put the argument in the right way, you'll get people to say it, but that's not realistic in terms of how people respond. That doesn't address the fear factor that Judy spoke to before. Right? And there is a fear factor about what's going to happen to one's health insurance. Right? So why play into it? Right? So there are really tensions and problems here which leave me personally quite uncertain as to what candidate would. I mean, I can say what policies I like best, but that's not necessarily the question of what is most likely to be effective and politically effective, and which candidate is most likely to be able to carry those policies. Right? And I don't have an answer to that question. For example, sort of end with a few things on this. I mean, I find one of the most effective, articulate candidates, who I think could be a remarkably effective candidate, is Cory Booker. I don't like him at all. I think he's a corporate Democrat in the Obama mold, and I've already told you what I thought about Obama.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Cory Booker spent most of his time trying to turn all of the education in Newark into charter schools. Right? Very close to the corporate community and his funding base. So I really don't trust him. But he's very smart. He's very articulate. He's very smooth, and he's very composed. And I think he would be a very effective candidate. Am I right or wrong? I don't know. Is it worth? Is that the path to go? Well, if you told me right away, he would win and this person would not, I'll support him, right? For obvious reasons in terms of our discussion. But I mean, is he? Do I care for his policies? Well, some of them are good. I mean, we could talk about some, but I don't want to get carried away in that, right? My personal preferences, personal, is really Elizabeth Warren. But I really think that she doesn't have the flexibility. She's been remarkable in the campaign trail, by the way. Much more effective interpersonally than people had thought. That's why she is having a significant success and may well win in Iowa. Right? I'm not sure, how much her positions will speak to the, as I said, white suburban women, for example, or that the white working class that needs to be moved to some extent and needs not to be alienated. I don't know the answers to those questions. But I am concerned about them. So let me conclude with the following. And I'm going to actually read to you a little thing I wrote, which if anybody follows in the blog that I wrote, then they will have this will remind them. It seems to me that what the Democrats are confronting is a campaign that really is mobilized around fear, obviously. There is not a positive program that speaks to the American electorate in terms of concerns, needs, well-being, or health, etc. It is a campaign organized and mobilized around fear. It is attacking minority community, blacks and Hispanics. It is attacking immigration, right? And it, of course, is, speaking to the economic base that supports it. Though, of course, there's tariff policies and some others do give the people in the corporate world qualms and certainly raise serious questions among the farm community. But the attachment to Trump is remarkable, and it's cult-like, and it's not clear, what its origins are, but it's fueled by resentments and hatreds, but it is not accessible by and large to rational fact, to argument or fact, clearly. I mean, that's quite obvious. And what is the amount and what are the numbers? It's not clear. I mean, some figures suggest that the cultish dimension is about 25% of the electorate. But if you follow the polls, he's really stayed somewhere between 41 and 45% approval rating. Really never gotten above that. Clearly not enough on its own to get elected. I mean, though, if it's targeted in the right areas, we've seen, in the race against Clinton, he only got about 47% of the vote, I think. Right? So clearly, Trump is building a campaign around hatred, around mobilizing fear, right? And he's seeking to make it, to identify Democrats, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, the whole thing with Ilhan Omar and Tlaib going to Palestine, to Jerusalem, Israel, was simply, he will do that continually. It will happen every few days. It doesn't, because to mobilize that and to try and turn the campaign into an argument between black and white is the key to his success. Right? And the challenge of the Democrats in general is how to respond to the racism and the xenophobia and the destructive, fear-based nature of the policies. How to respond to that without falling into the trap, into allowing this to be a fight between blacks and whites, or black and brown and white. Because we lose that fight. 65% of the electorate is white. Right? At the most, 30% of the electorate is black or brown. I've been talking about Asians and Pacific Islanders. Right? So we lose that fight. Right? Certainly we lose it in key states, where it turns white suburban women, or white working class, relatively uneducated males, right, away from the Democrats. So you cannot fail to counter and fight the racism and the xenophobia and everything else that goes along with that. But you can't fall into the trap, right, of defending those people against us. I say us meaning the white majority. That's a challenge. That's a difficulty. And I find that a lot of people that I deal with on a regular basis, I think, continually fall into that trap. And in fact, tend to be in a situation where if you don't fall into the trap, you're accused of being a sellout. Right? You're not defending the oppressed, the marginalized, adequately and sufficiently. That's a real challenge that's facing us. And I don't know how well we're going to deal with it. As I mentioned, the DSA vote, Democratic Socialists of America, saying they will not support. That's what they said, and hopefully that will change. They will not support anyone else but Bernie Sanders. Right? I think, from my point of view, there is no way Sanders gets the nomination. I do not think there is any way really that Biden gets the nomination. I think, but that's another question. It's just a projection on my part. I think the more one sees him, the less one likes him, if you try to follow what he thinks and says. But that's another story. But it's not clear to who can emerge in a way which will galvanize the galvanizable, mobilize the mobilizable, and not alienate the non-alienable. And I think I'll just leave it at that.